Chapter 4. Mao and International Relations, the Empty Stratagem, Chinese Deterrence, and the Quest for Psychological Advantage. Mao proclaimed his basic attitude toward international affairs on the eve of taking power. Before the newly assembled People's Political Consultative Conference, he summed up China's attitude toward the prevailing international order in the phrase "the Chinese people have stood up." We have a common feeling that our work will be recorded in the history of mankind, and that it will clearly demonstrate that the Chinese, who comprise 1/4 of humanity, have begun to stand up. The Chinese have always been a great, courageous and industrious people. It was only in modern times that they have fallen behind, and this was due solely to the oppression and exploitation of foreign imperialism, and the domestic reactionary government. Our predecessors instructed us to carry their work to completion. We are doing this now. We have united ourselves and defeated both our foreign and domestic oppressors by means of the People's Liberation War and the People's Great Revolution, and we proclaim the establishment of the People's Republic of China. To stand up to the world was a daunting prospect for China in 1949. The country was underdeveloped, without the military capacity to impose its own preferences on a world that vastly outmatched it in resources and, above all, in technology. When the People's Republic emerged on the world stage, the United States was the principal nuclear superpower, the Soviet Union having just exploded its first nuclear weapon. The United States had supported Chiang Kai-shek during the Chinese Civil War, transporting nationalist troops to northern Chinese cities after the Japanese surrender in World War II to preempt the communist armies. Mao Zedong's victory was greeted with dismay in Washington, and triggered a debate over who had lost China. That implied, at least in Beijing, an eventual attempt to reverse the outcome, a conviction reinforced when in 1950, upon the North Korean invasion of the South, President Truman moved the 7th Fleet into the Taiwan Strait, forestalling an attempt by the new government on the mainland to reconquer Taiwan. The Soviet Union was an ideological ally and was needed initially as a strategic partner to balance the United States. But China's leaders had not forgotten the series of unequal treaties extorted for a century to establish the Russian possession of its Far East maritime provinces and a zone of special influence in Manchuria and Xinjiang, nor that the Soviet Union was still claiming the validity of concessions in northern China extracted from Chiang Kai-shek in wartime agreements in 1945. Stalin took for granted Soviet dominance in the communist world, a stance incompatible in the long run with Mao's fierce nationalism and claim to ideological importance. China was also involved in a border dispute with India, in the Himalayas, over the territory known as Oxy-Chin in the west and over the so-called McMahon Line in the east. The disputed region was no small matter, at roughly 125,000 square kilometers. The total contested area was approximately the size of Pennsylvania or, as Mao later noted to his top commanders, the Chinese province of Fujian. Mao divided these challenges into two categories. At home, he proclaimed continuous revolution, and was able to implement it because he increasingly exercised total control. Abroad, world revolution was a slogan, perhaps a long-range objective, but China's leaders were sufficiently realistic to recognize that they lacked the means to challenge the prevailing international order except by ideological means. Within China, Mao recognized few objective limits to his philosophic visions other than the ingrained attitudes of the Chinese people, which he struggled to overwhelm. In the realm of foreign policy, he was substantially more circumspect. When the Communist Party seized power in 1949, substantial regions had broken away from the historic Chinese Empire, notably Tibet, parts of Xinjiang, parts of Mongolia, and the border areas of Burma. The Soviet Union maintained a sphere of influence in the northeast, including an occupation force and a fleet in the strategically located Lashan harbor. Mao, like several founders of dynasties before him, claimed the frontiers of China that the empire had established at its maximum historic extent. To territories Mao considered part of that historic China, Taiwan, Tibet, Xinjiang, Mongolia, border regions in the Himalayas or the north, he applied the maxim of domestic politics. He was implacable, he sought to impose China's governance and generally succeeded. As soon as the Civil War ended, Mao set out to reoccupy the secessionist regions, such as Xinjiang, Inner Mongolia, and eventually Tibet. In that context, Taiwan was not so much a test of communist ideology as a demand to respect Chinese history. Even when he refrained from military measures, Mao would put forward claims to territories given up in the unequal treaties of the 19th century, for example, claims to territory lost in the Russian Far East in the settlements of 1860 and 1895. With respect to the rest of the world, Mao introduced a special style that substituted ideological militancy and psychological perception for physical strength. It was composed of a Sinocentric view of the world, a touch of world revolution, and a diplomacy using the Chinese tradition of manipulating the barbarians, with great attention paid to meticulous planning and the psychological domination of the other side. Mao eschewed what Western diplomats viewed as the common-sense dictum that to recover from the decades of upheaval China should conciliate the major powers. He refused to convey any appearance of weakness, chose defiance over accommodation, and avoided contact with Western countries after establishing the People's Republic of China. Zhou Enlai, the first foreign minister of the People's Republic of China, summed up this attitude of aloofness in a series of aphorisms. The new China would not simply slip into existing diplomatic relationships. It would set up a separate kitchen. Relations with the new regime would have to be negotiated from case to case. The new China would sweep the house clean before inviting the guests. In other words, it would clean up lingering colonial influences before establishing diplomatic relations with Western imperialist countries. It would use its influence to unite the world's people. In other words, encourage revolution in the developing world. Diplomatic traditionalists would have rejected this attitude of aloof challenge as unfeasible. But Mao believed in the objective impact of ideological and, above all, psychological factors. He proposed to achieve psychological equivalence to the superpowers by calculated indifference to their military capabilities. One of the classic tales of the Chinese strategic tradition was that of Zhuge Liang's Empty City Stratagem from the Romance of the Three Kingdoms. In it, a commander notices an approaching army far superior to his own. Since resistance guarantees destruction, and surrender would bring about loss of control over the future, the commander opts for a stratagem. He opens the gates of his city, places himself there in a posture of repose, playing a lute, and behind him shows normal life without any sign of panic or concern. The general of the invading army interprets this sang-froid as a sign of the existence of hidden reserves, stops his advance, and withdraws. Mao's avowed indifference to the threat of nuclear war surely owed something to that tradition. From the very beginning, the People's Republic of China had to maneuver in a triangular relationship with the two nuclear powers, each of which was individually capable of posing a great threat and, together, were in a position to overwhelm China. Mao dealt with this endemic state of affairs by pretending it did not exist. He claimed to be impervious to nuclear threats. Indeed, he developed a public posture of being willing to accept hundreds of millions of casualties, even welcoming it as a guarantee for the more rapid victory of communist ideology. Whether Mao believed his own pronouncements on nuclear war it is impossible to say. But he clearly succeeded in making much of the rest of the world believe that he meant it, an ultimate test of credibility. Of course, in China's case, the city was not entirely empty. China eventually developed its own nuclear weapons capability, though on a much smaller scale than that of the Soviet Union or the United States. Mao was able to draw on a long tradition in Chinese statecraft of accomplishing long-term goals from a position of relative weakness. For centuries, Chinese statesmen enmeshed the barbarians in relationships that kept them at bay and studiously maintained the political fiction of superiority through diplomatic stagecraft. From the beginning of the People's Republic, China played a world role surpassing its objective strength. By consequence of its fierce defense of its definition of its national patrimony, the People's Republic of China became an influential force in the non-aligned movement, the grouping of newly independent countries seeking to position themselves between the superpowers. China established itself as a great power not to be trifled with while conducting a redefinition of the Chinese identity at home and challenging the nuclear powers diplomatically, sometimes concurrently, sometimes sequentially. In pursuit of this foreign policy agenda, Mao owed more to Sun Tzu than to Lenin. He drew inspiration from his reading of the Chinese classics and the tradition he outwardly disdained. In charting foreign policy initiatives, he was less likely to refer to Marxist doctrine than to traditional Chinese works. Confucian texts, the canonical dynastic histories recounting the rise and fall of China's imperial dynasties. Sun Tzu, the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, and other texts on warfare and strategy. Tales of adventure and rebellion such as Outlaws of the Marsh. And the novel of romance and courtly intrigue, Dream of the Red Chamber, which Mao claimed to have read 5 times. In an echo of the traditional Confucian scholar officials whom he denounced as oppressors and parasites, Mao wrote poetry and philosophical essays and took great pride in his unorthodox calligraphy. These literary and artistic elements were not a refuge from his political labors but an integral part of them. When Mao, after a 32-year absence, returned to his native village in 1959, he wrote a poem not of Marxism or materialism but of romantic sweep. It is the bitter sacrifices that strengthen our firm resolve, and which give us the courage to dare to change heavens and skies, to change the sun, and to make a new world. So ingrained was this literary tradition that, in 1969, at a turning point in Mao's foreign policy, 4 marshals assigned by Mao to outline his strategic options illustrated their recommendations of the need to open relations with the then archenemy America by citing the Romance of the Three Kingdoms, which was banned in China but which they could be certain Mao had read. So, too, even in the midst of his most sweeping assaults on China's ancient heritage, Mao framed his foreign policy doctrines in terms of analogies with highly traditional Chinese games of the intellect. He described the opening maneuvers in the Sino-Indian War as crossing the Hontu boundary, an ancient metaphor drawn from the Chinese version of chess. He held up the traditional gambling game of mahjong as a school for strategic thought. If you knew how to play the game, he told his doctor, you would also understand the relationship between the principle of probability and the principle of certainty. And in China's conflicts with both the United States and the Soviet Union, Mao and his top associates conceived of the threat in terms of a Wei-Qi concept, that of preventing strategic encirclement. It was in precisely these most traditional aspects that the superpowers had the most difficulty comprehending Mao's strategic motives. Through the lens of Western strategic analysis, most of Beijing's military undertakings in the first 3 decades of the Cold War were improbable and, on paper at least, impossible affairs. Setting China against usually far stronger powers and occurring in territories previously deemed of secondary strategic importance, North Korea, the offshore islands of the Taiwan Strait, sparsely populated tracts of the Himalayas, frozen swatches of territory in the Ussuri River, these Chinese interventions and offensives caught almost all foreign observers, and each of the adversaries, by surprise. Mao was determined to prevent encirclement by any power or combination of powers, regardless of ideology, that he perceived as securing too many Wei-Qi stones surrounding China, by disrupting their calculations. This was the catalyst that led China into the Korean War despite its relative weakness, and that, in the aftermath of Mao's death, would lead Beijing to war with Vietnam, a recent ally, in defiance of a mutual defense treaty between Hanoi and Moscow, and while the Soviet Union maintained 1 million troops on China's northern borders. Long-range calculations of the configuration of forces around China's periphery were considered more significant than a literal calculus of the immediate balance of power. This combination of the long-range and the psychological also came to expression in Mao's approach to deterring perceived military threats. However much Mao absorbed from China's history, no previous Chinese ruler combined traditional elements with the same mix of authority and ruthlessness and global sweep as Mao. Ferocity in the face of challenge and skillful diplomacy when circumstances prevented his preference for drastic overpowering initiatives. His vast and daring foreign policy initiatives, however traditional his tactics, were carried out amidst a violent churning of Chinese society. The whole world, he promised, would be transformed, and things turned into their opposites. Of all the classes in the world, the proletariat is the one which is most eager to change its position, and next comes the semi-proletariat, for the former possesses nothing at all while the latter is hardly any better off. The United States now controls a majority in the United Nations and dominates many parts of the world. This state of affairs is temporary, and will be changed one of these days. China's position as a poor country denied its rights in international affairs will also be changed. The poor country will change into a rich one, the country denied its rights into one enjoying them, a transformation of things into their opposites. Mao was too much of a realist, however, to pursue world revolution as a practical goal. As a result, the tangible impact of China on world revolution was largely ideological and consisted of intelligence support for local communist parties. Mao explained this attitude in an interview with Edgar Snow, the first American journalist, to describe the Chinese communist base in Yan'an during the Civil War. In 1965, China supported revolutionary movements, but not by invading countries. Of course, whenever a liberation struggle existed, China would publish statements and call demonstrations to support it. In the same vein, Long Live the Victory of People's War, a 1965 pamphlet by Lin Biao, then Mao's presumptive successor, argued that the countryside of the world, that is, the developing countries, would defeat the cities of the world, that is, the advanced countries, much as the People's Liberation Army, PLA, had defeated Chiang Kai-shek. The administration of Lyndon Johnson read these lines as a Chinese blueprint for support for, and probably outright participation in, communist subversion all around the world, and especially in Indochina. Lin's pamphlet was a contributing factor in the decision to send American forces to Vietnam. Contemporary scholarship, however, treats his document as a statement of the limits of Chinese military support for Vietnam and other revolutionary movements. For, in fact, Lin was proclaiming that the liberation of the masses is accomplished by the masses themselves. This is a basic principle of Marxism-Leninism. Revolution or people's war in any country is the business of the masses in that country and should be carried out primarily by their own efforts. There is no other way. This restraint reflected a realistic appreciation of the real balance of forces. We cannot know what Mao might have decided if the equilibrium had been tilted in favor of the communist power. But whether as a reflection of realism or philosophical motivation, revolutionary ideology was a means to transform the world by performance rather than war, much as the traditional emperors had perceived their role. A team of Chinese scholars with access to Beijing's central archives has written a fascinating account of Mao's ambivalence, dedicated to world revolution, ready to encourage it wherever possible, yet also protective of the necessities of China's survival. This ambivalence came to expression in a conversation with the head of the Australian Communist Party, E. F. Hill, in 1969, while Mao was considering the opening with the United States, with which China had been locked in an adversarial relationship for 2 decades. He put a question to his interlocutor: are we heading into a revolution that will prevent war? Or into a war that will produce revolution? If the former, the rapprochement with the United States would be improvident; if the latter, it would be imperative, to prevent an attack on China. In the end, after some hesitation, Mao chose the option of rapprochement with America. The prevention of war, which, by this point, would most likely involve a Soviet attack on China, was more important than the encouragement of global revolution.